But today, we're hearing from Jamie Mcgregor and Drew Greenway. Jamie is worship arts pastor at UBC here in Waco, and he received a Master of Divinity from Drew. Drew is the worship and care pastor at Harris Creek, and he received a Master of Theological Studies at Drew. We are very excited to have both these guys here, and we've had a connection with them in different ways. One of the ways is that their churches were a part of the doctoral dissertations that Nate Myrick and Marcel Stewart-Nagel did last year. And they connected very much into the work of these churches. So I read those dissertations, so I felt like I got to know you all quite well through reading your quotes and reading a lot of things that you all were a part of. But I also gained an admiration for the work that you're doing by studying that and reading it and what have you. So I appreciated the insights that you all brought into that project and all the things that you offered. So, lots of people that go to are part of each of your congregations. So, thanks for being here with us this evening. We really appreciate your taking this time. They're just going to take some time to share, and then as we get to a point, there'll be some time for questions. So, here we go.
Drew has told me that I have to go first.
You're sitting here first.
Thus I will. Well, it's good to be here. Once again, my name is Jamie Mcgregor. I'm going to talk about a lot of things, and hopefully this isn't too scattered. Somewhere in here we will find a description of our ministry and what we seek to do. Let us begin. I feel like a way to get into this that's necessary is talking about history of UBC. It's a fairly short one, so why not? 1994, UBC was started by two guys in their early 20s, Chris C. and David Crowder. They had a desire to start a church with these broad parameters of being a place for those who are over-churched, read people who have a history of the church that maybe soured or ended badly and they exited, and maybe they're looking for inner, and people who maybe had little to no contact with church and are seeking a way to get into that. When starting a church, it's good to have your Sunday morning stuff squared away, and what components can you find there? Some talking stuff and some singing stuff. So Chris was going to do the talking stuff. Dave wanted to do the singing stuff because he had a musical background. So when faced with sort of beginning this journey that would become the music ministry at UBC, he had a desire to do a couple things. One of them was learn to play guitar, and then prototype that the first Sunday that UBC started, which a little risky, but and then also when it comes to what songs do you gather together to sing with the church, he was familiar with plenty of hymns. He had grown up with that and was a little conversant with some newer music. But he went to Hastings with his friend Jack. It's Jack Parker. He still lives in town. He was in Crowder Band, etc. They bought a big stack of praise and worship CDs, took them back to their apartment, and began listening to soak in some songs that they would maybe be able to grab some language from. And their friend came down from upstairs, sort of like suspiciously came down and looked in the door frame, and then had an expletive-ridden commentary that he offered them that I will censor down to, "What is this? It is terrible." And they sort of laughed uncomfortably, and then he left, and they were able to determine, okay, so if we're going to be drawing out of this, well, perhaps we should find a way to do these songs differently. And we can ask the question, what does it mean? How do we do these songs? What does it look like for these songs to exist? ABC. So they navigated that. I don't really know the rest of that story. And they started, they were singing songs. You get a couple years in, 1996, there's a record release that is mostly a collection of older songs and some newer songs that they've worked up and done their thing. A few years later, you get the first release from David Crowder Band that's suddenly a bunch of original material, not exclusively, but mostly original material. And somewhere in there we find this desire to find how they play X song has evolved until it's write our own songs. And then keep those in conversation with other newer stuff and then some older stuff too. So that continues on. David Crowder Band becomes a thing, and they begin to travel and stuff like that. So then in their absence, you have like a B-team band or whatever that's happening at UBC, and they're carrying the same sort of charge to grab for old songs, maybe hundreds of years old or 50 years old, whatever, and then some newer songs, and then some original songs. This is a continued thing. Only they've begun to expand the newer songs category outside of the realm of nominally sacred songs, and grab from catalogs of indie rock bands and stuff like that they were listening to, where they were finding themes that seemingly would work just as well within liturgy, and they liked the songs, so they just did it, and sort of had this idea that, or it feeds into this idea that while sacred and secular aren't necessarily meaningless terms by any means, they sometimes tell us more about what we expect to find in art than what we will in fact find, or what it is. So anyway, that becomes a part of it. And that continues on. Eventually, the Crowder band disbanded, Crowder moved away. There was a guy named Ty, who was my friend, who was at UBC. He's a character. And then myself. This has been a through line of having this structure of old, newer, and original stuff. Within the midst of that, in 2005, Kyle Lake, teaching pastor at UBC at the time, was electrocuted while performing baptism and died. So the congregation had experienced trauma together and grieved for a good period of time. And that was around the same time that A Collision, or A Collision, depending on how you want to inflect that, was released from the Crowder band, which has a lot of themes about death and pain and grasping for hope in the midst of this. That was written and recorded before that occurred, but it ended up being this sort of framework that they could grab onto in the midst of this time. As a result of that, ideas of lament and pain within songs, that's a pretty big part of UBC still. That just kind of like got folded into the core of UBC music. So anyway, all to say, we have this, maybe we have the lament piece, and then grasping for a spectrum of music across the ages, and seeking to embody songs within the community. So not just to cover, but to sort of bring into ourselves and develop in some way. That I think comes out of the idea that we are seeking to grasp for words to sing as people in a particular time and place who are part of a stream that greatly precedes us, carrying a story that greatly precedes that. So that's maybe a broad thing that's history and ethos of how music is selected. Getting more into like a how sort of practical thing, how the music ministry functions. It mostly exists on Sunday mornings within the worship hour. And within that, we have a band format. So this would be like I'm bad with genres, like folk rock, alternative, post-grunge, I don't know. Sort of thing that is a band, and we have a set band. So there's not like a rotation. It's we have members of the band, and if somebody moves, we audition and replace them as needed. So there's strengths and weaknesses to that. There's some big weaknesses. An obvious one is not everybody who has musical gifting in the church is able to share that in the service on Sunday morning on a regular basis. That's a weakness. Plain simple. We try and offset that with other events, but to be frank, I've been there 4 years and I'm still figuring out how to develop that out. But we have some open mic stuff. We're gathering in more liturgies where we can have different sorts of music take place there, and things of this nature. But a strength that I do think holds of having a set band format for us has been you end up with sort of shared history or experience as a band. So when you play together, you have this thing that you're drawing from. You're not reinventing the wheel and trying to get in with each other with each new configuration or whatever. And you're also not starting from square one in terms of learning a catalog of songs each week. You find that there are some that are well-traveled territory, don't need a lot of attention, and then that leaves space to sort of reimagine or write new stuff as is needed. We rehearse twice a week, midweek practice, and then on Sunday morning, they're each about 2 hours long. Sometimes, if it's a particularly busy season, we'll throw in more than that. And within this, the idea is that hopefully we're embodying this music, learning it. We don't have any music stands in the building, which anytime we have a building rental, it seems like there's a need for music stands, and I'm always like kind of embarrassed. I'm like, we should just buy some to have around. But anyway, the hope is that we learn stuff. Sometimes, it's been full of humans, so sometimes you end up with just like papers on the ground and people squinting at stuff, but we throw it. So we do that. Now with this, there is, like if somebody's out of town, we don't replace, so if our drummer's gone, like our drummer's gonna be gone this Sunday, we don't then pull in another person who plays drums. We could do that, we don't. That becomes an opportunity that we take songs that we already have a way to play them and are forced then to say, how do we do that with these pieces instead? Or forced to sort of like reimagine that. That does a couple of things. Keeps us on our toes. It allows us to look at familiar songs in new ways. And sometimes that then influences the way that we play that with all the pieces present later. Sometimes that tweaks the arrangement such a way that we do that. Additionally, it's sort of this built-in rhythm as we go through the year of varying degrees of intensity in terms of like, we might have acoustic or just like sort of stripped down thing, and then like full band for a while, and it just has this thing. So I don't often get a lot of complaints about like, oh, it's too loud for too long, or oh, where's the drums? It's, we're missing this. But two of my pastors that I work with are on different ends of that spectrum. The guy's like, I only like it when it's acoustic. And the other guy's, I don't like it when it's really loud. So whatever, balance, I guess. So we have that. Let me just rein myself in here, make sure I haven't skipped over anything important. I don't think that I have. We'll move on. Another, I guess, way to talk about that and also move into function of what we're trying to accomplish would be to talk about this. We at UBC follow a church calendar. So that is governing sort of the primary themes of our liturgies year-round. And of course, that then affects our music. So late November, early December, we enter into Advent, which is a season that we are taking up themes of darkness and longing and waiting and stuff like this. I think N.T. Wright has a thing of like, it's a time where you look around and see how dark the world is and how very badly it needs a light. Mm-hmm. And then on Christmas, that light comes. So this is the story that we live in, right? So Christmas Eve is when we begin singing Christmas music. And we do that for the 2 weeks of Christmas. We get to Epiphany, which we do as a season. We get themes of light, and we're re-encountering Jesus. Again, we are critiquing and recalibrating the lenses through which we view Jesus, asking questions we think we've already answered. We go into Lent, where we begin asking questions about the things that we attach in our life to make us feel whole and complete, that we hope make us feel more alive, but they don't. They're actually killing us and dealing with sin. And we take up these things of penitence. And then on and on. I don't want to narrate the fullness of the rest of the story, but you get this becomes the primary themes that we're navigating within music. So music in this moment is seeking to amplify these themes within that. Within Lent, that would be the maybe best example that pulls on this. We have the first week of Lent stripped back to just an acoustic guitar. And each week up until Easter, we add an instrument back into the band, and then the last one's always drums. So I guess we could go drums for that. That one comes back in, and it's this sort of like this sort of journey that we go through. Sometimes those instruments are ones that we don't keep the rest of the year, or whatever. But with that, during our offertory time, we have an Andrew Peterson song called "In the Night" that we've stretched out. I think it's like 8.5 minutes long. There's just enough verses to have a different one each week for Lent. So week one, it's just verse, chorus, or whatever, and you're adding an instrument in as you go. By the time you get to Easter and the resurrection verse of that, you have a full band, and the fullness of the story sort of exploding kind of like happens with the music, and it's a fun time. But this is the way that the church calendar is affecting the way that we're doing music. I think along with that is the idea, it's not a secret, that music sort of like burns itself into your brain in strange ways. You get like these sort of poetic images that are fused in there, and then maybe knock about where you can't see them and inform the way that you think about stuff. They form you. As we go through the church calendar, we are picking up all these themes as we go, and hopefully that is working on us behind the scenes there. We're trying to populate our brains with stuff that we're going to be muttering under our breath that is just further pushing us into directing our attention toward God via particular themes throughout the year being formed together. Beyond that, within that moment, we are hoping to offer language to express emotion and to be formed in the way of Christ, and to share one another's burdens. So when we sing songs of pain, those who aren't feeling pain are then bearing the pain of other people. We sing songs of joy. Those who can't get to joy, they're having some sort of joy voiced for them by those who can. It's a communal thing. I'll be mindful of time and not get into your area. But yeah, this is the sort of thing that's going on there. And I'm going to talk for 30 more minutes, so I'll be talking. So, Leanne, if you would like to talk more about this, I'd love to grab a beverage of your choice and do that. So,
I love how they're always so thoughtful there, just with how you come in all of your services. So that's I think that's something to be said for. There's a lot of churches that just haphazardly step into Sundays and worship services, and that's not UBC. So thanks for that to you again. Yeah, so I'm Drew. I was gonna just kind of give a little bit about who I am. I'm originally from Arkansas. Anybody from Arkansas here? Gotta stick together. I went to Ouachita Baptist University, small liberal arts school, and then in 2000, when I graduated, 2006. As you do at a small liberal arts school, I got married right after I graduated. So my wife and I moved actually to Waco in 2007. Actually 2008, January 1st, 2008. Kind of just eyes wide open. I had planned on doing seminary, so we came to do Truett, and Harris Creek hired me to be their worship pastor. I was 23. And as a 23-year-old was kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing. I did have the advantage, my dad is a pastor and been a music minister for a number of years and became a lead pastor to church. So I had been around church work all my life. Both my parents are musicians. We both were afforded the opportunity to grow up in the probably not the best era of music, to be honest, but the punk rock type grunge movement of the 90s. And so I wanted to be Billy Corgan and play Smashing Pumpkins songs. God has used that because as a 12-year-old, I picked up guitar. And that was about the time that modern worship music, as we know it, it started becoming more of a thing in that time period. And so used to, there was like, Christian radio would play, I don't know, Sandy Patty, or name someone. And then worship music was kind of its own thing, was a little more organic, was passed around via, if you had a worship pastor go somewhere to a conference and you would learn a song, there wasn't such thing as MP3s or the internet. So, I remember specifically, like as a 9th grader, going to a conference and literally just like writing down the chords as I heard them, and then writing down the lyrics, and then taking it back to my church. So it was a really neat time because that was all so new and fresh. And for me, really, as far as calling goes, is whenever I really experienced that going like, this is something I love, this is something I was made to do, this is something that fits my gifting. And so that's kind of how I ended up doing music in undergrad and then pursuing it full time. So we moved here in 2008. Our church is actually 130 something years old, 136 or 7 years old. So old church, lots of history. It's one of the things we talk about a lot at our church, just all the different ebbs and flows of our church. At one point they were down to 12 people in the 70s and had to decide whether or not to keep the doors open, and they did. Fast forward to 2011, we went from about a 300-person church to a 2,000-person church, and probably the span of about a year, which was insane. That's not healthy, by the way. It's really hard to pastor people well when you do that. We started a downtown campus, so we meet at the Hippodrome every week. That was in 2011, all while not having a campus pastor there. So our staff that was at our other campus in Mcgregor would drive down on Sunday nights. We'd bring all of our gear, all of our musicians, and set it all up and do it over again on Sunday night. So that was a busy season. It was really fun, but we learned a lot of stuff about just burnout and how to sustain ministry. So that campus still exists today. I am the worship and care pastor at church, and so I lead worship mostly at our main campus in Mcgregor. The care pastor part of my job is what it sounds like. I head up our pastoral care ministry, which entails anything from visiting someone in the hospital to doing counseling, to doing premarital counseling, just, things that every pastor has to do, but I kind of head up those things and disseminate those among the staff. And really that's because I feel called to that. The church has been gracious to kind of see my giftings and go, hey, this is what makes you tick, and has really tailored my job to that, which is really fun. And so I wear the worship leader hat on Sundays and other times as well, and then spend a lot of time with people. So I actually wanted to kind of give you, as Jamie did as well, some of the how of what we do and also the why behind it. I failed to mention I've got 2 kids. I've got a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old boy, both boys, 3 and 6-year-old boys. And I kind of jotted these down when I was watching the youngest one at Chick-fil-A, so if it's incoherent, it's because I was trying to keep him alive. So maybe these are just kind of 4 points that I would say is an ethos that I kind of live by on how we've tailored our worship ministry to honor the Lord. So the first one is people first. I don't think you can do a good job as a musician or pastor or worship leader, anything involved in the church, if you don't care about people first. You can be the best musician in the world, and they will not care a lick if they don't know you care about them. And so, especially when making changes, I have found at our church, I kind of came in thinking that, our church, we kind of make jokes, we came from the cornfield, so there was like a church back 2 miles from where our current location is, and very old-fashioned Southern Baptist, what you'd expect that to be. And so I came in thinking, okay, I'm going to try to get us, move us along, progress us along as a church. And so my first couple of weeks would write down how many hymns we had played versus how many modern songs, thinking like I was going to have to kind of fight some of these battles, right, with people who are saying, hey, I feel uncomfortable. Turns out I just had to build trust with people. Like once they knew I wasn't going to come in and change stuff and then leave, or once they knew that I cared about them, it really made my job easier. And I didn't fight a lot of the worship wars that a lot of pastors face. That's credit to our church as well. Our church has always been a church that's forward-moving and forward-thinking, and so people have embraced that. But I would say people first, and also just one note on that, people are going to complain about stuff. They always do. And one of the things I've learned over the last 11 years at Harris Creek is to say thank you. Your first response wants to be like, no, you don't understand. We thought it through, this is this, and you know what? Just say thank you and give yourself time to reflect and then come back and have a conversation. It never goes well when you're defensive. So that's just something I've learned. Pastor people, as I said, that is the most important thing, and we are not glorified DJs. Right? So it is not just my job to pick songs and sing them. As you can tell from what Jamie was talking about, worship pastoring is so much more than that. It can be. And one of the things that is just one of my biggest pet peeves is when churches just want to hire someone to sing songs. And I think you're just missing out on such a rich liturgical element to your services, cohesive, yearly, as you were talking about, following the calendar. Just you're missing out on that piece if you don't hire pastors that happen to be musicians, and so that's just an important thing that I think is important for churches and kind of the context I come from. Secondly, I took this from Charlie Hall. I heard him speak a couple years ago, and it really spoke to me. And it's lead from off the mountain. And so, kind of where he got that from was Moses when he receives the tablets from the Lord. He comes down, and in Exodus it says his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. I think there are many worship pastors, me included, that are not spending time with the Lord during the week, that are not in communion with Him, that are not worshiping Him. And so what happens is you get to a place of dryness, of cynicism, of where you're leading on empty, and you get to a Sunday, and Sunday is just work. Now, I will say your work is your worship, but when it's just work all the time, then the work is just not fun. It's not fun, it's not fulfilling. And so one of the things that I took from him was that we should be spending that time on our own so that people are getting the outflow of who we are on a Sunday. Does that make sense? And so that's been really huge for me. Whenever I was doing seminary and working full time, I was not always coming with overflow on Sundays. Sometimes it was like, oh gosh, I gotta make the Purpose Center file, on Saturday night, and I have a test, Monday. And so it was, but that, in that season was just what he said was really spoke to me, just as there are gonna be seasons where you feel like you're on empty, and people can sense that even if you're really good at faking it. And so I happen to be friends with a couple of the Crowder Band guys, and they had that same sentiment, like you get to a point where you're just on autopilot and you're leading people in worship, and you've gotten so good at your craft that you can kind of fake it, but you're missing out on so much more as far as the communion with people and with God as you're doing that work. And so this is an important thing I've learned from that. My iPad keeps turning off. Also, on that same point, one of the big things for me, I have this tattooed on my body actually, is that your worship is your service. And so that comes from the Greek word latreia, and just the idea of service. If you're going into worship ministry, your act of worship is to lead people. And so I've often seen, especially in the modern worship paradigm, it's kind of the idea, if I don't commune with God and with these people, then I'm missing out on leading them. And I would say, actually kind of push back against that and say, no, like, your job is to engage people with the Father, and that is your form of worship for that time. And so, again, to the same point, if you're using your times of leading as your time of worship and communion with God, you're missing out on being able to be an effective leader. And so, and if you guys have pushed back against that, I'd love to talk about that. I think it took me a while to get to that point. And so that doesn't mean that you can't experience, the Holy Spirit as you lead, and doesn't mean that you're not thinking about the words you're singing. But let's all be honest. When we're engaging in music, you're thinking about like what you're gonna eat for lunch, right? Or whenever I'm leading worship, I'm thinking, oh, I hope the guitar player doesn't miss this part, or I'm thinking like, there's all kinds of things you're thinking about. And so I don't think that's always the worst thing, is what I'm saying. Third thing, in all things excellence. In Colossians it says, whatever you do it for the Lord. And I have often been bothered in the modern worship paradigm where people kind of haphazardly approach songs and approach music and just say, well, it's worship, and so let's just hope that it all happens, and people will appreciate it. And I think if we're gonna worship the Lord, He deserves our best. And I think you guys can appreciate that as musicians. Anything you approach, to do it with excellence, especially when it comes to playing for the Father. And so you see that in Scripture. I'm pretty sure David wasn't a bad harp player. I hope he wasn't. The idea of Malcolm Gladwell, you guys are familiar with him, the idea from Tipping Point, the 10,000 hours. So he says to really be an expert at something, you have to have practiced it 10,000 hours, which is a ton. But one of the things that I've found for worship leadership is if you're not good enough to your craft, to think independently, to be able to play and to do what you're doing and also think independently of that, you're going to be so narrowed into that, you're going to miss a whole lot of things. So as a worship pastor, I can't just learn 4 chords and use a capo and hope to fake it enough to be able to practice a band and go, okay, if I'm so worried about playing my part right, then how am I going to be able to practice a band to where I can get it all together and be seamless? And so that, to me, that's been a huge thing, is just to be proficient enough. And you can speak to this too, like there are times in your life where I don't pick up a guitar for a week, and I'm like, that's not okay, because I've got to be proficient enough to where I can think outside of what I'm doing. Does that make sense? We could talk more about that if you guys would want to. That just removes the distraction, ultimately, and frees you up to do your job well. One of our kind of core values at Harris Creek is the idea of create over reproduce. So one of the values we hold is that we don't want to just copy stuff other churches are doing because it's working for them. We want to do stuff that is pertinent to our church, that our church needs. And also with that, the same idea of excellence, we want to be able to be creative people. Madeline L'Engle is one of my favorite authors. If you haven't read Walking on Water, read that book 10 times before the end of the year. It's amazing. I mean, I've probably taken people through it 10 times myself, and every time I learn new stuff. But one of her big things is the idea that we are creative people, that God, we are embodying the incarnation of Jesus when we use our gifting, when we are tapped into that. And so I think that we miss out when we try to replicate what other people are doing and not do something that's organic to who we are in our churches. And so we've tried to do that at our church, much like UBC has, in slightly different ways than you guys. That's a huge thing for us. Just because you call it Christian doesn't mean it's good art. And I think we, a lot of the times, slap the label Christian on something and hope people appreciate it. Or we slap the label secular on something and say, no, that's not welcome here. And I think the line is way more blurred in the eyes of God than we allow it to be. And so I think hearing a Mozart cantata played by in a church, people would be fine with today. If you played something from popular radio in a church, people would go, that feels weird. And I'm like, well, why? Like, what's the difference, right? If God made the music, if it's honoring to Him, the actual music itself. So that I think that can open a whole can of worms. I understand, but just for our purposes, we have tried to blur the lines of that a little bit and help people along in that, and to allow ourselves the freedom to try new stuff. And I think, again, the idea that just because you call something Christian does not mean that it is good. So I can get on a soapbox there. One of the other things we've tried to do at Harris Creek is to embrace technology. Churches have been doing this for centuries. You have going from literally just one voice or unison to polyphony, to adding pianos, to adding organs, to adding all the different stuff. So we have tried to do that tastefully. We don't just jump on the next wave immediately, but have also tried to embrace technology. Some of the technology we use currently, maybe this is kind of in the weeds, but I mentioned ProPresenter. That's presentation software we use. Planning Center Online, you guys familiar with that? Anybody? Oh my gosh. I remember like emailing people back in the day, and like we didn't have text either, so it was like, hey, can you play 2 weeks from now? Okay, I'm gonna mark this on my Excel file. Like it was terrible. Ableton Live is a program we use. Do you guys use that?
We use it for the little click.
You're so much cooler. We use it for click, and then we also use loops and tracks at times as well. And then as far as I wanted to talk a little bit about, I'm running out of time, aren't I? I'm talking too much. Let me move on from that. I one more.
I think I misread the clock earlier.
Fourth one is, which Jamie already touched on a little bit, is liturgy matters. And you know, people who say, well, we don't have a liturgy, well, yeah, you do. Your liturgy is that you don't have a liturgy. It can be haphazard or organized, right? So there can be a haphazard liturgy where you just arrive on stuff as you go. Unfortunately, a lot of Baptist churches, in my experience, are right there. They just kind of float along, and if a new song comes on the radio, it's like, let's do that one. And Christmas time comes, Advent comes, and they get back from Thanksgiving, they're like, oh gosh, we got to put out the Christmas trees. And there's not a rhythm in place, and we, much like them, have tried to take the church calendar and say, what can we do? I think one of the reasons Baptists are bad at that is because they have seen, you know, the break off from the Catholic Church, and say, they're like, well, we're Protestant now, so we don't do all that stuff. And you go, well, wait a minute, like, yeah, what can we do that enriches people's faith and their lives? And so we have tried at Harris Creek to do that in a way that's not stale, but that brings rhythm and life to those seasons. And the idea of like adding to that, like that stuff, I love that stuff. And so we've tried to do that, and it brings a challenge, because every year, okay, it's Advent season, what are we going to do now that to try not one up yourself, but also to bring rhythm, to make it meaningful. You know, we've got All Saints Day coming up, and we typically do something for that. You know, and so that's fun as a worship pastor, because it gives you the chance to be creative, but also within the bounds of, this is like, churches all over the world are celebrating this today, and it's really a grounding thing for your church. And at our church, we found people love it, and they didn't know they missed it all their life until now they have it, and they're like, oh my goodness, you know, how come I haven't been a part of an Ash Wednesday service before? This was incredible. And so, you know, as Jamie said, songs have a way of sinking deep into your souls. And so at the end of the day, whenever I ask myself, why am I a worship pastor? It's that, you know, my grandmother had dementia, died about 5 years ago, and she loved the Lord with all her heart. She had scripture memorized like the back of her hand, and music. She could sing even the third verse that nobody sings in hymns. She knew, right? And as she got older, and as she got worse as far as dementia goes, she couldn't remember scripture. She could still sing every hymn lyric that she knew. And I think that speaks to what music does for all of us. And so I guess if you could remember one thing I said, it's that what we do matters in that sense. And you are giving people things to remember when they don't even know if God loves them. And you're giving them songs to recall. And I think that's one of the most powerful things we can do. So I get emotional about that, because I think it's just so important. But yeah, I think I had a couple other things, but sure, I think that's good. I understand that we can kind of have a dialogue. Is that all right? Sure. So.
So I wanted to thank you for mentioning that kind of connection with God during the week, because I know even as a student, sometimes, you know, when papers get due, you know, that connection sometimes is lost.
Yeah.
And you know, it's kind of ironic. I'm talking about the church and its music, and I don't have a connection during the moment. So I think that's really important. So I wanted to thank you for mentioning that.
And that's not something that's distinctly worship pastors, every pastor deals with that. And I mean, students, seminary, you go to the seminary, you have students that are writing papers about scriptures and are not reading the scripture. You know what I mean? And so that's a common experience for a lot of us.
And I have one more question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, you mentioned All Saints, so I'm Catholic.
Yes.
And so I'm really curious of what a Baptist All Saints Day might.
Well, you know, here's what's funny. I, as a good Baptist boy, didn't experience a lot of these things. So it's been fun because we just kind of go, a really great resource I forgot to mention is called Worship Sourcebook. I got a lot, I've gotten a lot of like making sure I'm not being heretical with what we're doing from that, because it'll help explain, or I'll just even like Google like All Saints and like what typically people would do. For us, we actually do, we'll obviously sing lots of songs that are, that like there's a great Robbie C song Tears of the Saints is another one. There are several songs that we'll use in our liturgy. We'll do some readings, remembering the people who have gone before us, even if they're still alive. And then at the end of our service, we actually do a thing with carnations where we have people come up and take a carnation and place it in a vase to remember someone who has been Christ to them. And so that's just kind of our simple way of doing it.
Do you celebrate communion on that?
We do.
As well?
Yeah, we actually at our church celebrate communion every week. We have, what's that?
I'm jealous.
We have communion available by intinction, which is you take a piece of bread and dip it in the cup for anyone to respond, typically after the message. And then we try to average once a month. We try to corporately take communion all together. And so for us, honestly, it's an easy way to present the gospel because we say, hey, you know, this is specifically for people who are believers in Jesus. And if that's not you, we would love to talk with you. If that is you, you're welcome to take this as a way of remembering what Christ has done for you. And so it's not as formal as what would be in a Catholic liturgy, but we've tried to kind of take those things, and we use the term ancient modern, and so we try to take the best of the old and the best of the new, and that's kind of how we end up where we are. So I'm talking too much.
No. Answer your question. I'm trying to think. This will be the first year that we're doing like a specific All Saints sort of service. But historically, that's looked like whichever Sunday is closest, we'll do communion, and people will bring photos of either their loved ones that have died or just any figure. So sometimes it'll be just like an important theologian. Sometimes people will bring photos of saints that are significant to them. A lot of people who have come out of various Catholic traditions or just stop them off here and then they'll go back and
They still have it.
Do you have choir? Why or why not?
We just opened a sanctuary yesterday, so if I haven't been very coherent, that could be why. And so the space we'd been in for 12 years, the stage was not big enough to hold. We probably did choir 4 or 5 times in that space. It's really hard to make happen. My plan is to incorporate that more in the coming months and years. We actually, I failed to mention this, we do a rotation for our volunteers, so we have about 50 musicians between our 2 campuses, and we just, which he kind of already stated the pros and cons of those things. The cons for us is that our other worship pastor is a female, so she doesn't do any of the same keys that I do. So everybody has to learn all the keys, right? And so then, or she'll do things differently than I do, so then they learn a song one way and then they play with me. And so there are challenges to that, the cohesiveness of the band, and you have to keep you on your toes. But I love choir, so I guess I sort of answered your question. We don't all the time.
we don't. I'm not gonna say that we never will, but we just kind of have a energy rock band, and choir is not necessarily the go-to thing to grab for that. I will say, You know, sometimes I like to know what's gonna definitely make me cry anytime I watch it. Sometimes you need a good cry. So for a while it was the scene in Lost where Desmond calls Penny, but we don't need to talk about that. There's a group called I think it's Cantus Domus. It's like a choir in Germany, I think. And there's some videos of them singing with Damien Rice and also with Bon Iver, and really anything that they do, I'm just like, I just melt. So I'm a big fan of the human voice. But yeah, just the answer is we don't have one.
I think that's actually why.
Why? Why don't you have one? I'm just curious.
Well, some of that, yeah, I mean, it's literally just like space restriction. So I think actually choir is going to come back to that type. So I guess our world more because of what you're talking about, the power of the human voice together. We just did a collection of songs in the round in a living room of some original songs, and that was one of the most powerful moments I've had at Harris Creek, of all those voices singing together. So I would ask myself why as well. So,
And interject that a few years ago for one of our the Learn Innovators series, David Crowder was here for a residency, and in the lecture or the conversation that he had with church music students, he said without a question that the lack of the congregation who have musical skills to participate in a more wholehearted leadership way, also known as choir, he perceived as the greatest weaknesses of the contemporary movement. And he said that his view was that until the contemporary church finds a great solution for that, then the contemporary church was going to fail or going to struggle with having fulfilled its complete mission or something along those lines. And, so thought a lot about that, and I thought a lot about, so what are the options? And I think it is up to you all to figure that one out. And just because the ideas have to come from inside, because if they're imposed from others, they won't be received in the way that they ought.
yeah.
And so I think they really, there's those of us who have a lot of ideas, but I think the ideas would have to come ideally from the inside and have to be organic. So anyway,
That's good.
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
An important one. Yeah. So just wanted to because we already mentioned that.
That's great.
David Crowder. So
Yeah, and I respect what my predecessor has said. Another way of looking at that too, or a way to directly answer your question, is we haven't had a strong desire for one within congregation wide. There are people who are gifted that way, but it hasn't been a strong movement. I haven't had a strong personal desire to bring one in. We don't have a lot of space for one. But beyond that, I view the congregation in some way as a choir. We all sing. We don't have to sing, but we all are singing at each other in a metal box. In our case, but so just to answer head on, I don't want to avoid it like it. You just haven't.
So you mentioned it a tiny bit of balancing between what the congregation needs as like the analysis of their culture, where they come from versus like what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you find that balance between the two, or how do you like, what ways have helped you analyze balancing between what they want and need?
I think on our end, there's sort of a way that you can approach that is have values that you're operating from in your ministry, and let those be the guiding thing. And then if those values are suddenly out of sync with a lot of people within the congregation, then those values no longer fit that church, right? Mm-hmm. So I think insofar as you have values that seem to be received by the congregation as a whole, for the most part, that you're in good territory, and there's a way in which you can't please everyone. You can't just respond to everyone, so that's a one part of it. And I think I'd say there's another way to look at it and wonder from a pastoral sense and trying to provide the sorts of things. So if somebody's asking you to do a specific song that maybe you have a personal vendetta against, right? I don't know.
Right.
Like, how do you do that? I think, once again, you find yourself in a value situation. You talk to that person, and if it's like one person that has a thing that's directly against the values of the place, well, I mean, it's a conversation you have. If it seems as though the values of the place and the values of the individual in that seat are at odds, well, somebody's got to move, and it's probably going to be the individual over his correct. Is that an answer to what you're saying?
Yeah. I think that's how I'd first do. I mean, one thing I would say is back to just the intentionality in which you plan. If that's your MO all the time, people understand that you don't just happen upon songs, or just hear a new song and throw it in on a Sunday. So people are less likely to feel like they can just like treat you as a DJ based on their preferences if you're being intentional with the way you plan services. That doesn't mean you don't listen and say, hey, yeah, maybe we will do that sometime if that fits. That's typically what I would say is like, that is a great song. If we can find a place that works well in our worship services, absolutely. And so, you know, that doesn't always mean you're going to do it. But at least just, I think you have, as a pastor, you have to perceive people's desires and needs. They're in your church, like, I mean, you know, so. Does that help?
Yes, sir, yeah.
And I think at times maybe to take it further with the particular song sort of thing, because that happens, I think being honest is important. And
Yeah.
If there's a song, like, I don't know, this hasn't happened to me yet, but I mean, there are songs that I've heard people say they like, I'm not going to name any particular ones, that I don't think say anything worth saying.
Yeah.
And thus, I don't want to try and put those words in people's mouths on the Sunday morning. And that would be a thing that you need to communicate. You're going to be like, oh, that song's meaningless, you shouldn't even like it. But just like, hey, I'm struggling to find a way to put that in conversation with what we're doing. I think here's some primary themes in it. Maybe we could look at other songs that have these themes, but I'm glad that song's meaningful to you.
Yeah. I'll be honest, there are songs that I just don't like, and I've had to learn how to put that to the side. Because there are songs that I don't like that I have led that have impacted our church in ways that I would have never known. And so putting the preference aside, so where I would be quick to be like, yeah, that, you know, that, yeah, so that's hard.
So with volunteer musicians, do you audition them? Like, how does that process work for y'all? And what do you do if they're not very gifted?
Yes, we audition. We did that most recently for drums, I think, which is always a fun time. But no, that was a situation where nobody was bad. But it doesn't matter. It's, you know, good, bad, mediocre, whatever. It's always hard to tell somebody that they're not the one. You know, that's hard. But I think when you're not doing it to be mean, you can let yourself off the hook a little bit. But just say, hey, went with somebody else.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it, that honestly, that's the hardest part of my job, I think. You know, it's a body of Christ thing for me. It's like, if you're not gifted in these areas, let's find the place where you are gifted and can give to our church. And so one of the things, we audition people all the time, and I have to tell people no. A lot of times we don't say no, we say not yet. And so that's just to say the door's still open. Is there another place you could serve with us? And I also give very specific reasons why. So we lay out the expectations for every instrument that we have. And one of the issues for us is we only practice on Sunday morning. So if you can't cut it with us to where we're having to sit there and teach you parts, if you can't pick out a melody on the piano during the week without me showing it to you, then it's not going to go well on a Sunday. So people generally know that going into the audition. So then the expectation, like, they'll even know, like, oh, this isn't going well. And then I specifically will meet with them and say, hey, here's why this won't work for us. But that doesn't mean that you can't serve with us. That doesn't mean you can't audition again. Could you go back and maybe learn the way that we do things and try again? And it again, music is so personal that it stings. And so that's the part I don't like. I'm a people pleaser. So I used to just be like, yeah, you can join with us, and I would never like schedule them. Well, that's passive aggressive is what that is. So like I've just tried to say like, yeah, I mean, again, like if somebody wants to preach, do we just say, okay, like we protect that, right? So why would we protect the other stuff? Or if somebody is terrible at making coffee, we don't want them making coffee, right? So I mean, I don't think it always has to be so like harsh to someone, but I do understand that it's hard to say that.
So y'all have been doing this for a good minute, and so you've had to work under pastors, they're your bosses. So what is your biggest piece of advice regarding, I guess, coming under the vision of someone else and with worship, especially for those people who maybe think like, sitting in a classroom right now, they have the whole world figured out, and they're going to come under someone else's leadership, and maybe it's a completely different culture than what they grew up in, or even where they interned or whatever.
I attended UBC for 4 years before I was on staff and played in the band and was formed by that leadership and the pastoral staff. Like lead pastor, same then as now, so I have been my pastor. That's not a super common place to find oneself because I came in and was already a familiar face, had already been doing music. I would play music some Sundays anyway, so that was a different sort of transition. In that case, that was pretty easy. But I know that there's a lot of talk about when you're in a new place, you don't just come in and start changing stuff. You are a student for a year and everything is like your teacher and then you're formed. But anyway, that's not going to be a very useful thing. So.
Yeah, no, I think it's a balance of feeling passionate about what you're doing and being the expert in that, and also being willing to say, yeah, I trust your leadership, and it's building that relationship with that person, and ultimately you need to be able to trust each other, and so we are actually without a lead pastor right now. I've been under two lead pastors at Harris Creek, and was fortunate both times to have lead pastors that trusted my instinct, trusted my direction that we were going. There were times where we'd miss where, Brady was our former pastor and he'd say, man, you guys, this song would be perfect. And I'd be like, yeah, okay. And it wouldn't go well, right? And then kind of he realized, yeah, like I gotta trust his instinct. And there were other times where I would be really hesitant to do a song, and then that ended up being a perfect, and Brady was actually, both of our former pastors were pretty creative, and so even like sitting together in a room and planning out an Advent series with them, it was fun. And I think that's how it should be, is like it's this cohesive, we're a team. How can we make the word and the worship present one big beautiful picture? And I think if you can do that, there are times where you'll have bumps and bruises, but for the most part, it's gone well for us. Does that kind of answer your question?
Okay, let's say thanks to our
Yeah.